The basement door didn't have a padlock. It had a new deadbolt, fresh metal, bright screws, installed crooked like someone's hands were shaking when they drilled it in. And over the deadbolt, someone had hung a cheap "Do Not Enter" sign like the kind you'd see on a construction site. But this wasn't a job site. This was a family home with framed school photos in the hallway, a bowl of fresh oranges on the kitchen counter, and a calendar on the fridge with Kevin written in blue marker on 3 different days. Soccer, dentist, birthday party. Kevin was everywhere, except in the house. For 5 months, the family explained his absence with the same rehearsed softness. He's staying with friends. He needed space. He's fine, just going through something. And for 5 months, nobody challenged it. Because family lies are built to sound like privacy, not deception. Then a relative came to visit. Not a close one. Not the kind who already knew the family's rhythms. This was the kind of person who notices what everyone else has learned to ignore, who counts the chairs at the table and hears the pauses in conversation. She noticed there were 5 place settings, but only 4 people ate. She noticed Kevin's shoes were still by the stairs, dusty, untouched. She noticed the way the mother flinched when someone said the name casually. And she noticed something else, too. Every time the basement was mentioned, laundry, storage, the breaker box, the father's face tightened for half a second, like he was swallowing a word before it escaped. On her 3rd day there, the relative walked past the basement door and heard something. Not a voice, a sound, dull, rhythmic, wrong. Like a slow bump against wood from the other side. She stopped. The house was perfectly still. Upstairs, the family laughed at a sitcom. The laughter sounded too loud, too steady, like it was being used to fill space. The relative stared at the new deadbolt, then at the sign, then at the faint scuff marks near the bottom of the door. Fresh scratches, as if something heavy had been dragged across the floor recently. She turned back toward the living room and asked the only question that mattered. "Where's Kevin?" And in the silence that followed, the mother didn't answer first. The father did, and his answer didn't explain anything. It confirmed everything. Before this story continues, subscribe to Crimes Within. This channel explores the darkest secrets hidden inside families, the crimes that don't happen in alleys or headlines, but behind familiar doors. And while you're listening, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. These stories come from quiet homes, but the people listening are everywhere. This is not a story about a missing child in the traditional sense. There are no frantic searches, no missing posters, no urgent calls to police in the middle of the night. Because what happened to Kevin didn't begin with panic. It began with routine. Breakfast served on time, school bags still hanging by the door, laundry folded as usual, and a basement that suddenly became off-limits. For 5 months the family functioned in a careful balance, never speaking too much, never explaining too little. Every answer was soft enough to discourage follow-up. Every silence was framed as respect. That's how family crimes survive, not through violence, but through agreement. Agreement to stop asking, agreement to stop noticing, agreement to accept explanations that don't actually explain anything. This story unfolds slowly, the way real domestic secrets do, through small details that feel insignificant until they begin to form a shape. A name not spoken, a room never entered. A lie repeated so often it starts to sound like truth. And at the center of it all is a question so simple it feels almost rude to ask. Where is Kevin? Over the next hour, you'll hear how one person, an outsider by just enough distance, noticed what everyone else had trained themselves not to see. How a locked door became louder than any confession. And how a family's attempt to preserve normalcy ultimately revealed something far worse than chaos. Because some crimes don't tear families apart. They hold them together. Until someone asks the wrong question. The relative's name was Laura, and she had learned long ago that families reveal more by what they avoid than by what they say. She arrived on a Sunday afternoon with a small suitcase and no expectations. This wasn't a holiday visit. It was practical, helping after a minor surgery, staying a few days, being useful without being intrusive. That was the role she had been invited to play. At first, everything felt normal. The house smelled like disinfectant and cooked food. The television murmured constantly, as if silence itself had been outlawed. Family photos lined the hallway, birthdays, vacations, school plays. Kevin appeared often, smiling, younger than Laura remembered, frozen in moments that suggested a future that had already been decided for him. But Kevin himself was never mentioned directly. Not at dinner, not during small talk, not when Laura asked about school schedules out of habit and was gently redirected to another topic. "He's doing his own thing right now," the mother said once, too quickly. Laura nodded. Families had phases. Teenagers disappeared emotionally all the time. That alone meant nothing. What unsettled her were the inconsistencies. Kevin's room was still made every morning, not carefully, efficiently. The bed always tight, the desk clear, the trash empty. It didn't look unused. It looked maintained, as if someone wanted it to stay exactly the way it had been. His phone charger was still plugged in. On the second day, Laura offered to do laundry. The mother hesitated. "I'll take care of it," she said, reaching for the basket too fast. Laura noticed the basket was unusually light. Later that night, Laura woke to a sound she couldn't place. Not loud enough to be alarming, but persistent enough to pull her from sleep. She sat up, listening. A dull thud. Then nothing. She told herself it was plumbing. Old houses made noise. Families learned to ignore them. In the morning, she noticed fresh bruising on the father's knuckles. Small yellowing marks that suggested repeated impact over time rather than a single accident. "Work," he said, when she asked casually. He didn't meet her eyes. The basement came up naturally that afternoon. The power flickered, and Laura joked about old wiring. "We don't go down there anymore," the mother said lightly. "It's a mess." Laura smiled, but something in the phrasing stuck with her. Anymore. The door itself looked wrong. Not old and neglected, but recently altered. The wood around the frame bore fresh scuffs. The deadbolt gleamed against worn paint. It wasn't meant to keep people out casually. It was meant to keep something contained. That evening, during dinner, Laura noticed the rhythm of conversation. It flowed carefully around gaps. When Kevin's name surfaced accidentally during a story about childhood vacations, the table went quiet for just a beat too long. Then someone laughed too loudly and changed the subject. Laura began to feel something else creeping in. Complicity, not in the sense of shared guilt, but shared maintenance. Everyone was working together to keep the surface intact. No one appeared panicked. No one seemed surprised by the locked basement. Normalcy had been negotiated. On the fourth night, Laura stayed up after everyone else went to bed. She walked the house slowly, not searching, just observing. She paused by the basement door. Up close, the scratches near the bottom were unmistakable. Not claw marks, not accidental. They were linear, uneven and angled, as if something heavy had been dragged, then repositioned. Laura's chest tightened. She placed her ear against the door. Nothing. She stepped back, feeling foolish. That was when the sound returned. A single soft impact, wood against wood, not repeated, not rhythmic, deliberate. Laura's heart raced, but she didn't scream. She didn't knock. She didn't unlock the door. Instead, she did something far more dangerous. She went back upstairs and waited. Because if there was one thing she understood about families like this, it was that the truth rarely revealed itself through confrontation. It slipped out when routine broke, and Laura intended to break it. Laura didn't confront anyone that night. Confrontation would have been easy, dramatic, emotional, and ultimately useless. Families that survive on secrets are trained to absorb pressure and redirect it. What they are not prepared for is disruption disguised as normalcy. The next morning, Laura behaved as if nothing had changed. She made coffee, she asked about errands, she commented on the weather, and while she did all of that, she watched. The mother avoided the hallway near the basement entirely. She moved through the house in careful arcs, never passing the door unless she absolutely had to. When she did, her pace quickened, her hand brushing the wall as if grounding herself. The father hovered, not over Laura, over space. He positioned himself instinctively between her and the basement whenever she drifted too close. It wasn't obvious. It was practiced. The kind of movement you don't notice until you know to look for it. At breakfast, Laura casually mentioned Kevin. "He'd love this weather," she said, spreading jam on toast. "He was always the one who wanted to be outside, right?" The mother's hand froze mid-motion. The father answered instead. "People change," he said. "He's not a kid anymore." Laura nodded, as if that settled it. But later she checked the calendar on the fridge again. Kevin's name was still there. Future dates included. No one had bothered to erase them. That afternoon, Laura offered to run to the grocery store. The mother insisted on coming along, citing a long list that could easily have been handed over. They drove in silence for several minutes before the mother spoke. "You're probably wondering about Kevin," she said, eyes fixed on the road. Laura didn't answer immediately. "I assumed if there was something I needed to know, you'd tell me," she replied carefully. The mother exhaled, relieved by the lack of pressure. "He's safe," she said quickly. "He just needed distance." Laura let the word hang in the air. "Distance from what?" she asked. The mother's jaw tightened. "From us," she said. "From expectations." That explanation had been rehearsed. Back at the house, Laura noticed something new. The basement light flicked on briefly, then off, while no one was downstairs. The father had been in the kitchen. The mother was outside on the phone. Someone else had used the switch. That evening, Laura waited again. This time she didn't stand by the door. She sat at the top of the basement stairs, close enough to hear, far enough to remain unseen. The house settled into sleep. Minutes passed. Then the sound returned. 3 soft impacts. A pause, then a faint human noise, not a voice, but a breath forced through clenched teeth. Controlled, suppressed. Laura's hands trembled. She backed away silently, heart pounding. She didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, Laura made a decision. She called another relative, someone the family trusted, someone who had known Kevin well. She didn't accuse, she didn't speculate. She asked a simple question. "When was the last time you spoke to Kevin?" There was a pause on the line. "Before summer," the relative said. "Why?" Laura looked at the calendar again. It was October. That afternoon, Laura intentionally broke routine. She went to the basement door while both parents were in the living room. She touched the deadbolt, not turning it, just resting her hand on the cold metal. The mother stood up immediately. "Don't," she said. The word came out sharp, unfiltered. Laura turned slowly. "Why?" she asked. The mother's eyes filled, not with anger, but fear. The father stepped forward. "It's storage," he said. "Old stuff. Dangerous down there." Laura looked between them. "Where's Kevin?" she asked quietly. The question landed differently this time. The father opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The mother sat down heavily, as if her legs had given up without consulting her. Laura didn't raise her voice. She didn't threaten. She simply said, "If you don't tell me, I will call someone who will ask harder questions." The silence that followed was not empty. It was crowded. Crowded with 5 months of decisions. 5 months of maintenance. 5 months of telling themselves they were protecting something, each other, their image, their remaining family. Finally, the father spoke. "He didn't leave," he said. Laura felt the room tilt. "What did you do?" she asked. The father shook his head. "We didn't mean to," he said. "It just got out of control." Laura stood there, heart racing, understanding fully now that Kevin hadn't disappeared. He had been absorbed by the house, by the lie, and whatever was locked behind that door was no longer just a secret. It was evidence. Laura didn't call the police immediately, not because she doubted what she had heard, but because she understood how fragile the moment was. Families that have maintained a lie for months don't collapse all at once. They fracture slowly, and pressure applied too early can cause the truth to retreat further underground. She needed confirmation, and more importantly, she needed to make sure Kevin was no longer being harmed, if he was still alive at all. Laura asked to sit down. The parents complied automatically, like people following instructions they had been waiting to hear. The father stared at the floor. The mother clutched her hands together so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Start from the beginning," Laura said, "and don't skip anything." The mother spoke first. Kevin had become difficult, she said, withdrawn, angry, asking questions they didn't like answering. He pushed back against rules that had always been non-negotiable: curfews, friends, privacy. They framed it as concern. They framed it as discipline. What they didn't frame it as was fear that they were losing control. One night, 5 months earlier, Kevin had argued with his father in the basement. The reason sounded trivial now: grades, a phone, disrespect. But it escalated. Voices rose. The door was closed so the neighbors wouldn't hear. Kevin threatened to leave. The father grabbed his arm. Kevin resisted. The mother came downstairs. What happened next was described in pieces, not chronologically, not clearly, just fragments, each spoken as if saying it out loud for the first time made it less real. Kevin fell. He hit something. He didn't get up right away. They panicked. They didn't call emergency services. They didn't call anyone. They convinced themselves they had time to think, to wait, to see. Kevin was conscious, the mother said. He was hurt, confused, angry. He shouted. He demanded to be let out. They locked the door. "At first," the father said, "it was just until we figured out what to do." They brought food down, water, a blanket. They told themselves they were protecting him, from himself, from consequences, from the outside world. Days passed, then weeks. Kevin stopped shouting. He stopped asking questions. The mother began avoiding the basement entirely. The father went down alone, late at night, staying longer each time. Laura listened, stomach twisting. "Why didn't you call for help?" she asked. The father looked up. "Because once you call," he said, "you can't undo it." Laura realized then that this wasn't about one moment of violence. It was about 100 smaller decisions afterward. Every day they chose silence over accountability. Every night they reinforced the lie. "What condition is Kevin in now?" Laura asked. The mother shook her head, sobbing. "I don't know," she said. "I stopped asking." That was the most terrifying admission of all. Laura stood up. "I'm calling emergency services," she said, "right now." The father blocked her path. "Please," he said, "we can fix this. We just need time." Laura met his eyes. "You've had 5 months," she said. "Kevin hasn't." She stepped around him and reached for her phone. The mother screamed, not in anger, but in terror. "No," she cried. "They'll take him away. They'll take us away." Laura dialed anyway. She described the situation carefully. No accusations, no speculation, just facts. A locked basement, a missing child, 5 months of concealment. The operator's voice changed instantly. Within minutes, the house filled with motion, sirens in the distance. The parents sat frozen, as if the moment they had feared had finally arrived, and there was nothing left to do but wait. Laura unlocked the basement door with shaking hands. The deadbolt resisted at first, then gave way. The door creaked open slowly. The smell hit her immediately. Stale air, damp concrete, something else she couldn't name. "Kevin?" she called. No response. She descended the stairs carefully, heart pounding. At the bottom, the light revealed a space that had once been storage and had become something else entirely. A mattress, empty food containers, marks on the wall, and silence. Laura realized with a sickening clarity that whatever had happened in that basement, it had gone far beyond discipline or panic. It had become captivity. And now, finally, it was about to be seen. The first patrol car arrived before the ambulance. Blue lights flooded the front of the house, cutting through the carefully preserved normalcy like a blade. Neighbors stepped onto porches. Curtains shifted. The family's secret, protected for 5 months by silence and routine, had finally crossed the threshold into the open. 2 officers entered the house cautiously, guided by Laura. They didn't rush. They didn't shout. Their calm made the situation feel more serious, not less. The parents were separated immediately, not aggressively, professionally. The mother collapsed into a chair, sobbing uncontrollably. The father stood rigid, hands clenched, eyes fixed on the basement door, as if staring long enough might undo what was about to happen. An officer descended the stairs with Laura behind him. The basement looked worse under official lighting. What had seemed survivable in dimness now appeared stark and unforgiving. The mattress was thin and stained, the air was stale enough to burn the lungs. A small plastic bucket sat in the corner, unused in weeks. "No sign of recent activity," the officer said quietly. Laura's chest tightened. Another officer joined them. They checked corners, behind shelves, inside an old storage closet that had been blocked by boxes. Every empty space made the silence heavier. Upstairs, the paramedics arrived. Laura climbed back up, her legs unsteady. She watched as officers spoke to the parents separately. The questions were simple, direct, and unrelenting. "When did you last see him? Who went downstairs? Why didn't you call for help?" The parents' answers unraveled quickly now that they were no longer performing for each other. Details conflicted. Timelines shifted. Each tried, unconsciously, to minimize their own role. The mother insisted Kevin had been alive recently. The father avoided answering altogether. Then one officer returned from the basement holding something small. Kevin's phone. It was dead. The screen cracked. The timestamp on the last notification was over 3 months old. Laura felt the floor tilt beneath her. The father finally broke. "He stopped responding," he said quietly. We thought he was sleeping, or pretending." The officer's expression didn't change. "When did you realize he wasn't?" he asked. The father swallowed. "We didn't," he said. "That was the moment the narrative collapsed. Not because of violence, but because of neglect. Because no one checked." The parents were taken into custody without resistance. As they were led outside, neighbors stared in disbelief. The house that had looked so ordinary now felt contaminated by the truth that had lived inside it. Laura sat alone on the couch as the officers finished documenting the scene. She stared at the calendar on the fridge. Kevin's name was still written there. Days he would never attend. Later, at the station, investigators reconstructed the timeline. Kevin had survived the initial incident, that much was clear, but he had deteriorated slowly, without medical care, without monitoring, without anyone willing to confront reality. There was no single moment to blame, only accumulation. The charges reflected that truth. Not a single act, but prolonged confinement, neglect, and concealment. When the news broke, the headlines were careful. They avoided graphic detail. They framed it as a tragic domestic case. But Laura knew better. This wasn't a tragedy that happened suddenly. It was one that was maintained by routine, by silence, by fear of consequences. At night, Laura sometimes replayed the moment she first heard the sound from the basement. She wondered how many times it had happened before she arrived. How many nights the family had chosen television volume over listening. The house was eventually sold, the basement renovated, the calendar thrown away, but the question that ended everything still lingered. Not what happened to Kevin, but how long everyone had helped it happen by not asking. The investigation did not end with the arrests. In many ways, it had just begun. Once authorities moved beyond the house and into the family's history, a quieter, more disturbing picture emerged, one that explained how 5 months of captivity could exist without intervention, suspicion, or interruption. Investigators started with school records. Kevin's attendance had dropped sharply in the weeks before his disappearance. Teachers had documented changes in behavior: withdrawal, irritability, missed assignments. One counselor had requested a meeting with the parents. It was scheduled, then cancelled. No follow-up was ever made. The system noted the concern, then it moved on. Friends were interviewed next. Kevin had stopped responding to messages abruptly. At first, they assumed he was grounded or had lost phone privileges. When weeks passed, they grew uneasy. But teenagers learn quickly which concerns adults take seriously. They told themselves it wasn't their place. Extended family members admitted something similar. They noticed Kevin's absence, but explanations came packaged with authority. Parents know best. Families have privacy. Teenagers leave home all the time. No one wanted to be the person who overreacted. Digital records revealed more. The parents had searched for phrases like runaway teen rights and how long before police investigate missing child. The searches weren't frantic. They were methodical, spaced weeks apart, as if the family was checking in on the lie to make sure it still held. Text messages between the parents showed careful coordination. "What did we say last time?" "Stick to the same story. Don't add details." It wasn't panic driving them anymore. It was maintenance. Neighbors were questioned again, this time with different framing. When asked directly about Kevin, several admitted they hadn't seen him in months. One recalled hearing yelling late at night around the time he vanished, but dismissed it as normal family conflict. Another neighbor mentioned the basement light being on unusually late, often past midnight. No one had called it in, because nothing felt urgent enough on its own. Investigators reconstructed the nights after Kevin's initial injury. They found evidence that food had been brought downstairs consistently for the first several weeks. Containers, packaging, empty bottles. Then the pattern changed. Less food, fewer trips. Eventually, none. Medical experts concluded Kevin would have experienced progressive weakness, confusion, and eventual loss of consciousness without care. The timeline suggested he had been alive for weeks after the door was locked. Weeks. That realization reshaped the case. This was no longer about a single act of violence. It was about sustained indifference. During interrogation, the parents' defenses collapsed in stages. At first, they framed themselves as overwhelmed, then as confused, then as victims of circumstance. But each version failed under scrutiny. They knew Kevin was there. They knew he needed help. They knew calling for assistance would expose them. And every day they chose not to act. Laura was interviewed again, this time as a key witness. She described the house's emotional atmosphere, the way silence was curated, the way Kevin's absence was treated as a topic with sharp edges. Investigators listened closely. Family crimes, they explained, often relied on shared denial. No single person carried full responsibility at first. Each small decision redistributed guilt until no one felt fully accountable, until someone outside the system asked a question that couldn't be smoothed over. "Where's Kevin?" The question didn't reveal the crime. It broke the agreement. The prosecutor later summarized the case in a way that unsettled even seasoned officers. "This wasn't a secret," she said. "It was an arrangement. An arrangement between fear and convenience, between image and consequence, between what was easier to believe and what was harder to face." As the trial approached, public interest grew. Commentators debated whether the parents had intended harm. Some argued negligence, others argued something darker. Laura ignored the noise. She focused on the calendar still in her memory, the one where Kevin's future had remained written long after his presence was erased. She understood now that the basement wasn't the only locked place in that house. The truth had been sealed behind routines, excuses, and the shared decision not to ask too much. And it had taken only one person, slightly outside the circle, to notice what everyone else had been trained to overlook. The trial did not begin with drama. There were no outbursts, no shouted accusations, no shocking revelations in the opening statements. What unsettled the courtroom was how ordinary everything felt. The parents sat side by side, well-dressed, composed, their posture carefully neutral. To anyone unfamiliar with the case, they looked like people enduring a misunderstanding, not defendants facing the consequences of months of silence. That illusion did not survive the first week. The prosecution did not focus on the basement at first. They focused on patterns, on routines, on the slow erosion of responsibility that had allowed the situation to exist without interruption. Witnesses testified about cancelled appointments, unanswered messages, unexplained absences. Teachers spoke about concerns that never escalated because no single incident seemed severe enough. Neighbors described noises they dismissed, lights they noticed but rationalized. Each testimony was minor on its own. Together, they formed a structure. The defense attempted to dismantle it by arguing intent. There was no plan, they claimed, no desire to harm, just a moment of panic that spiraled. But panic does not last 5 months. That was the prosecution's quiet refrain. Digital evidence became the turning point. Search histories were read aloud in court, stripped of context, reduced to cold timestamps. Messages between the parents were projected on a screen. Careful, deliberate exchanges about consistency and control. The jury watched the parents' faces change for the first time. The mother cried openly. The father stared forward, jaw tight. Then Laura testified. She spoke calmly, without accusation. She described noticing what others ignored. The locked door, the maintained bedroom, the rehearsed answers. When she repeated the question she had asked in the living room, "Where's Kevin?" the room went completely still. That question echoed through the remainder of the trial. Medical experts explained the consequences of prolonged confinement without care in clinical language. No graphic detail, just progression, decline, outcome. The jurors listened intently. This was not a case built on one catastrophic act. It was built on a series of decisions not to act. The defense attempted to shift blame outward, toward stress, toward social pressures, toward fear of authorities. They argued the parents had convinced themselves they were protecting their family from greater harm. The prosecutor responded with a single sentence. "Protection requires action," she said. "What we see here is avoidance." By the final week, the parents no longer looked composed. The illusion of normalcy they had maintained for months could not survive daylight and repetition. When the verdict was read, there was no reaction, no collapse, no protest, just resignation. The parents were found guilty on multiple counts related to unlawful confinement, neglect, and concealment. The sentence reflected the accumulation of harm rather than a single charge. Outside the courthouse, reporters asked Laura how she felt. She didn't answer immediately. "I think," she said finally, "people imagine crimes like this happen because someone is cruel. But sometimes they happen because no one wants to be uncomfortable." She left without elaborating. Years later, the house would be renovated and resold. New owners would never know what had happened there. The basement would be finished, the door replaced, the calendar gone. But Laura would remember the sound that woke her in the night, not because it was loud, but because it had been ignored. The case didn't fade after the verdict. It spread, not because of sensational details, but because of recognition. Families across the country watched the coverage and saw something unsettlingly familiar. Not the basement, not the crime, but the patterns, the pauses before answers, the explanations that sounded reasonable until examined, the moments when concern was dismissed as intrusion. Social workers and counselors reported a noticeable shift. More calls came in that didn't start with certainty, only discomfort. "I don't know if this is anything," callers would say. "I might be overreacting. I just have a bad feeling." Kevin's name was rarely mentioned publicly, but the question that had ended the lie traveled quickly. Where is he? Schools began revisiting protocols that had been treated as flexible. Missed meetings were flagged more aggressively. Extended absences without verification triggered follow-ups that hadn't existed before, not because the system had suddenly become perfect, but because people had learned what silence could cost. Laura noticed the change personally. She began receiving messages from strangers, short notes, no details. "I think something's wrong in my family. Your story made me ask questions. I didn't want to be the one who caused problems, but now I can't ignore it." She answered when she could, carefully, never telling people what to do, only reminding them that discomfort was not the same as harm and that asking questions was not betrayal. In one message, a woman wrote that her nephew had gone quiet months earlier. The family said he was staying elsewhere. The explanation had held until it didn't. Laura urged her to involve authorities. The child was found alive. That knowledge haunted Laura as much as it comforted her, because it meant something else was true. Kevin's story was not rare. It had simply crossed a line others hadn't yet. Experts began to speak publicly about collective denial, not in accusatory terms, but descriptive ones. Families, they explained, often operate like closed systems. Once a narrative is established, maintaining it becomes a shared responsibility. Challenging it feels like disloyalty. The parents in Kevin's case had not acted alone. They had relied unconsciously on the expectation that others would look away. And they had been right until they weren't. The trial transcripts were eventually used in professional training sessions, not as a warning, but as a study in gradual escalation. The language was neutral, the lessons were not. Silence, they emphasized, is rarely neutral. At the same time, criticism emerged. Some accused the coverage of encouraging suspicion within families, of eroding trust. Laura listened to those arguments carefully. Trust, she understood, had never been the problem. Unquestioned trust had. One afternoon, months later, Laura returned to the neighborhood where the house stood. Construction crews were finishing renovations. Fresh paint covered old walls. The basement windows were open, letting in light. It looked harmless, normal. Laura stayed only a moment. She didn't need to go inside. She already knew what the house represented. Not evil, not madness, but the danger of comfort becoming justification. The family had not woken up one day and decided to commit a crime. They had woken up each day and decided not to disrupt their version of normal. That was the lesson people couldn't unsee. And that was why Kevin's story didn't end with the sentence. It continued quietly, in homes where questions were finally asked, and in others where the absence of questions still lingered. Breaking the silence did not leave Laura unchanged. People like to imagine that doing the right thing brings closure, that once the truth is exposed, life settles back into balance. For Laura, the opposite happened. The case followed her into ordinary moments, reshaping how she moved through the world. Family gatherings became strained. Some relatives thanked her quietly, others avoided her entirely. No one said it outright, but the message lingered in the spaces between conversations. You asked the question we were afraid to ask. One aunt told her gently but firmly that she should have handled it privately. Laura asked how. There was no answer. At night, Laura replayed small decisions she had made during those first days in the house. She wondered whether she should have acted sooner, whether noticing faster would have changed the outcome. Rationally, she knew responsibility didn't work that way. Emotionally, the weight didn't care about logic. She began volunteering with an advocacy group focused on family neglect cases, not as a spokesperson, not publicly, just listening. What she heard confirmed what the trial had already revealed. Most cases didn't begin with cruelty. They began with fear of exposure, fear of judgment, fear of losing control. One caller described a locked bedroom for discipline. Another mentioned a family rule about not involving outsiders, no matter what. The language shifted, but the structure stayed the same. Containment disguised as care. Laura learned to recognize the early signs. The way explanations arrived too quickly, the way absences were treated as inconveniences rather than concerns. She learned that the most dangerous moment was not confrontation, but reassurance. Everything's fine. You're imagining things, don't make it worse. Those phrases had protected Kevin's captors longer than any lock. Publicly, interest in the case eventually faded. Another story replaced it. Another outrage, another headline. But for the families who had seen themselves in the details, the lesson remained. Asking questions did not destroy families. Avoiding them did. One afternoon, Laura received a letter from the prosecutor who had handled the case. It was brief, unemotional. Your testimony mattered, it read. Not because it proved something, but because it interrupted something. That sentence stayed with Laura. Interrupting harm was rarely dramatic. It was uncomfortable, awkward, and often isolating. It meant being seen as difficult, disloyal, overreacting, but it also meant refusing to participate in silence. Years later, Laura would be asked in an interview, one she almost declined, what she believed people misunderstood most about cases like Kevin's. She thought carefully before answering. People think the danger is the locked door, she said. It's not. The danger is how many people walk past it without asking why. The interviewer expected something stronger, something angrier. Laura didn't give it. Because anger had never been the problem, comfort had. And comfort, once challenged, rarely forgives the person who challenges it. Laura accepted that. She had learned that doing the right thing didn't make you popular. It made you necessary. Time did not soften the story. It clarified it. As years passed, Kevin's case stopped being referenced as a tragedy and started being cited as an example. In training rooms, in legal seminars, in quiet conversations between professionals who dealt with domestic cases, it was no longer framed as an anomaly. It was framed as a pattern. Investigators revisiting similar cases began to notice the same early signals Kevin's story had revealed. Locked spaces explained away as storage, sudden privacy rules, children or dependents who needed distance but never seemed to go anywhere, families that insisted everything was under control while refusing outside help. The system adjusted slowly, imperfectly but noticeably. Mandatory check-ins became harder to cancel. Follow-ups were required instead of suggested. Absences were no longer treated as neutral gaps. None of it was foolproof, but fewer doors stayed closed indefinitely. Laura followed these changes from a distance. She never became an advocate in name. She didn't give speeches. She didn't turn her experience into identity. But she noticed when professionals spoke differently, when discomfort was treated as a signal rather than an inconvenience. Kevin's story had taught them that harm doesn't always announce itself. It negotiates. One investigator put it plainly during a workshop. If a family controls the narrative long enough, reality stops arguing back. That sentence echoed the truth Laura had lived. The parents remained incarcerated. Appeals were attempted, then denied. Public sympathy faded as the details became harder to excuse. Not because they were shocking, but because they were sustained. The defense had once argued that the parents were overwhelmed, that fear had driven their decisions. But fear does not maintain a lie for 5 months. Fear hesitates. Fear cracks. What happened in that house required something steadier. Resolve to preserve image, resolve to avoid consequence, resolve to treat silence as strategy. That realization reshaped how Kevin was remembered. He was not defined by what was done to him. He was defined by what his absence revealed. Laura eventually stopped receiving messages from strangers. The wave passed. The story settled into the background of public memory, where lessons often live quietly. But occasionally, she would hear someone ask a question they hadn't before. Can we check? Has anyone actually seen him? Does this explanation make sense? Those moments mattered more than headlines ever could. One evening, Laura visited a community center where a support group met for people navigating difficult family situations. She didn't speak. She listened. A woman across the room described noticing inconsistencies at home and feeling guilty for questioning them. Laura caught her eye. Guilt isn't a warning sign, Laura said gently. It's just a feeling. Silence is the real risk. The woman nodded slowly. That was how Kevin's story lived on, not as a cautionary tale meant to frighten, but as permission to notice, permission to interrupt comfort, permission to ask. Laura never returned to the house where the basement door had once been locked. She didn't need to. The place had been erased physically, but the structure that allowed it to exist remained everywhere, in homes that valued appearances over honesty, in families that treated questions as betrayal, in systems that waited too long for certainty. Kevin's story reminded people that certainty often arrives last, discomfort arrives first, and ignoring it has consequences. In the end, the basement door became a symbol, not because it was locked, but because so many people had accepted that it should be. Investigators reviewing the case years later focused less on the physical evidence and more on the social mechanics that had protected the lie. The door had been reinforced, yes, but the stronger barrier had been agreement, spoken and unspoken, that certain questions were off-limits. When professionals discussed Kevin's case in training settings, they no longer emphasized the moment of injury. They emphasized the weeks that followed, the meals brought downstairs, the explanations rehearsed upstairs, the calendar left untouched. Those details mattered because they revealed intent without spectacle. The parents had not acted in isolation. They had relied on the expectation that others would defer to parental authority, to family privacy, to social comfort. And for months that expectation held, until it didn't. Laura's role in the story was never framed as heroic in official records. She didn't rescue anyone. She didn't uncover a hidden mastermind. What she did was smaller and far more disruptive. She refused to participate in silence. That refusal changed the trajectory of everything that followed. In a post-trial review, one official noted that the case altered how investigators interpreted reasonable explanations. Previously, consistency had been mistaken for credibility. Now, consistency without verification raised flags. Because lies, when maintained long enough, become smooth. Too smooth. Laura eventually returned to her own routines. Work, friends, ordinary days. The story receded, but it never disappeared. It reshaped her instincts. She listened more closely when people spoke too carefully. She noticed when discomfort was dismissed as imagination. She also learned to accept something difficult. Some people never forgave her, not the parents, not even the extended family, but others, the ones who had quietly looked away because her question had forced them to confront their own avoidance. That was the cost, and she accepted it. Years later, when asked in a private setting whether she believed Kevin's case would have ended differently if someone had spoken up sooner, Laura didn't answer immediately. Yes, she said, but not because of one big action, because of 100 small ones that never happened. The locked door had not been the beginning, it had been the result, a result of delayed discomfort, of postponed accountability, of the belief that protecting an image was safer than exposing a problem. Kevin's name eventually disappeared from public memory. It did not need to remain visible to remain influential. Its impact lived on in the moments when someone chose to ask instead of assume, in schools that followed up one more time, in relatives who pressed gently but firmly, in neighbors who trusted their unease. The story did not end with justice feeling complete. It ended with understanding becoming unavoidable. The basement door had stayed closed for 5 months, not because no one could open it, but because everyone agreed not to try. And that agreement, more than the lock, more than the lie, was the true crime within. The locked basement was never the real secret. The real secret was how easy it was for everyone to accept it. Kevin didn't vanish overnight. He didn't disappear into chaos or confusion. He faded quietly, day by day, while explanations were repeated, routines maintained, and questions politely avoided. This story isn't about a hidden monster or a moment of uncontrollable rage. It's about how normal life can continue around something deeply wrong, how comfort, routine, and fear of disruption can become tools of harm. What happened to Kevin was not sustained by cruelty alone. It was sustained by silence, by people choosing not to notice, by explanations that sounded reasonable enough to stop curiosity, by the belief that family matters should stay inside the family. And that belief is what made the crime possible. If one person hadn't paused at the locked door, if one question hadn't been asked out loud, if discomfort had been ignored just a little longer, the door might have stayed closed forever. That's why stories like this matter, not to shock, not to accuse, but to remind us that the most dangerous crimes don't always look violent from the outside. Sometimes they look like quiet houses, polite conversations, and routines that never change. If there's one thing to take from Kevin's story, it's this: silence doesn't protect families, it protects harm. And asking a question, especially the uncomfortable one, is sometimes the only thing standing between routine and tragedy.